Planned Parenthood, is that why they exist right now? Because they want to kill black babies? No, Planned Parenthood exists because they want to kill babies, and they don't care what color the baby is. They just want the money that comes from it. But these policies disproportionately impact certain groups. Okay, they might, but that doesn't mean that they're intended to do that. A disproportionate number of black Americans end up in prison. Does that mean that that's why the prison is there, to put black Americans in it? No. The reason why a disproportionate number of black Americans end up in prison is that, unfortunately, a disproportionate number of black Americans commit violent crime.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Hope all is good wherever you are. In this video, we have Matt Walsh absolutely owning the host of the show. But whatever side of the argument you fall on, this is the types of conversations, debates that we need to be having. Respectful, no shouting. This was great. Let's get into it.
You said earlier that we have less racism here than lots of other countries, which I think is a fair point to make.
Glass half full.
And obviously you would acknowledge that at some point in our history we had lots of racism, right?
Sure.
Lots of racism then, less racism now. Mm-hmm. So when did we get to a point where it wasn't systemic and it was no longer a problem that we as a democratic society need to deal with? Like, what was the moment in your mind?
Well, I'm not sure that you could point to one exact moment in time when it goes from a systemic issue to not systemic anymore. But what we know for sure is that right now we are certainly in the moment where it's not systemic. Any time in history, I'll answer your question. Yeah. At any point in history, when you can go back and look at actual laws and policies that were in place that deprived black Americans or any other group of rights, well, that was a time when you had systemic, and we know that existed historically. Yeah. So if you wanted to point to an exact moment, I mean, I guess the most obvious moment would be the Civil Rights Act. But of course, these are changes that happen gradually over time. Just like with slavery, you can't, even with slavery, you can't really, people like to point to the Emancipation Proclamation as the moment when slavery was ended. Of course, we know that wasn't when it ended. So we know we don't have slavery anymore. But if you were to ask me, what's the exact moment when slavery stopped? Well, it wasn't an exact moment. It was a gradual ending of that horrific institution. But certainly now it doesn't exist anymore, in this country anyway. And I'd say the same thing with systemic racism as well, that nobody is creating policies, again, that are deliberately intended to create disadvantages for quote unquote people of color.
I have a question about that. A lot of conservatives will say there is one policy, and this is, you're about as anti-abortion and pro-life as it gets. Mm. A lot of conservatives will say a remaining institution of systemic racism is abortion because it disproportionately, as conservatives make this argument, affects black children and black families. Is that an example of systemic racism or racism, period?
And I think it's a mistake when conservatives make that point, because I think conservatives are very desperate to be able to do the whole thing where they turn back on Democrats and say the Dems are the real racists.
Yes.
And I just think that's a lame move, and you're trying to use the left's own language against it, which I think it doesn't work because you're accepting sort of their premise. So what I'd say about abortion is, no, it's not systemically racist. It does disproportionately impact the black community, no question about it. But does it exist for that? Really, is Planned Parenthood, is that why they exist right now? Because they want to kill black babies? No, Planned Parenthood exists because they want to kill babies, and they don't care what color the baby is. They just want the money that comes from it. But it just so happens that ends up disproportionately impacting the black community. And this goes to the disproportionate impact thing, which I'm glad you brought that up, because that's usually what's used to support the theory of systemic racism, is they say, well, but these policies disproportionately impact certain groups. Okay, they might, but that doesn't mean that they're intended to do that. A disproportionate number of black Americans end up in prison. Does that mean that that's why the prison is there, to put black Americans in it? No. The reason why a disproportionate number of black Americans end up in prison is that, unfortunately, a disproportionate number of black Americans commit violent crime.
Yeah, so far I fully agree with Matt Walsh. The fact that it disproportionately affects the black community, it's not intended to do that. You look at institutions and you can say whites have more institutional power, have all the institutional power. That's false, and it's observationally false as well. Look around yourself and you will see it. Not all institutions are run by white people, nor are all institutions dedicated to the advancements of white people. There's a lot more white people in positions of power than, say, black people, for example, in terms of sheer numbers, but that's because there's more white people, period. Black people are 13% of the population. A minority of the population is going to be a minority in most institutions at all levels. The fact that the percentage of black people in jail is very high, we can trace that down to stuff like fatherless homes and many problems with the inner cities, but it's not the system. A minority of the population is going to be a minority in most institutions at all levels. When we talk about representation, that would be one, but you can't say that the institutions themselves are racist when you had a black president for 8 years. The fact is, we can't say that black people are not equal or don't have institutional power when the most powerful man in the country for 8 years of our lives was a black man. The claim makes no sense. It's incoherent, in my opinion. And we can talk about laws, because when you talk about institutional racism, you have to talk about laws. Laws are not constructed to advance white people. There are no laws, period, zero, that explicitly favor white people. No laws at all in the country. None, zero. There are laws that disfavor white people with stuff like affirmative action that's related to policies, but you cannot provide an example of something like affirmative action that explicitly favors white people. It cannot be done. There is none out there. It doesn't exist. The reverse exists, but that's it. Let's get back to it.
That's just what the stats show. And
Right. So there's an argument that a system is what it does, and that claiming otherwise is just kind of hocus pocus, just magic. Like if a system produces a certain result, but you as an observer of that system say, well, actually, that's not what the system is supposed to do. Those words are just meaningless.
What about
and
a
that
system?
the system just chews them up and spits them out and produces and continues to produce the result that it produces. Like, for instance, during Jim Crow, pre-Civil Rights Act, you've got laws on the books that are systemically racist, that allow for straight up racist results. When it comes
Design
to
of the system was explicitly racist.
Design of the system is aimed at producing segregated schools and low-income households. Low-income neighborhoods that are predominantly or almost exclusively populated by Black Americans. Right? Mm-hmm. You then pass laws that reform those laws, that make it so that you can't legally do those things anymore. Yet the power structure broadly remains in place, and the results stay the same. You still have, broadly speaking, massive low-income areas, predominantly populated by Black families, and you continue to have segregated schools. And so a person who was born into this country today, if they're Black, they're more likely to grow up in one of those neighborhoods. They're more likely to go to terrible schools rather than good schools. They're more likely to end up in prison or in part of the system. And so you would step back and say, well, the system is still doing what it is. The system never stopped doing it. There was never a day from Monday to Tuesday to Wednesday that all of a sudden the system stopped working in the same racist way, which we acknowledge was racist when it was written into the law.
Although the system
But
produces...
now we pretend it's not because we struck through that one line.
Yeah, but if we agree that you say the system is what it does, I'd probably disagree with you on that. What the system is intended to do is what it certainly matters here.
But why?
But also,
why would it matter? What we intend a system to do? Because
the system produces a robust Nigerian middle class, like people who come here from Nigeria. Thomas Sowell makes this point. It's a point that's popular.
So then that's a defense of the system.
That's what I'm saying.
Because that's what it does.
Right, that's what I'm saying. So does that go both ways?
No, because the intent of this, my point is that the intent, whatever you intend a system to do is meaningless. Like if you intend for a house to have a roof and a second floor that is sturdy, but when you walk into the second floor, you fall through it.
But that doesn't
reflect
collapses
on you.
But that doesn't reflect on your anti-roof sentiments.
Yeah, and also
it doesn't matter.
And also, but to use your analogy, if you walk into a house and there's a problem in the house, you can't automatically assume that it's the fault of whoever built the house. It could be, depending on the problem. But you also have to look at who's living in the house, who's supposed to be maintaining the house. And if you're living in a house and you're not taking care of it, and in fact you're mistreating the house, and it goes to hell, and then you turn around and blame whoever built the house 100 years ago, well, I'm going to say, like, well, this is at some point you got to take responsibility for your own house. And so that's my point with the black community as it stands right now in America. Yes, as we've already established, there was actual systemic racism against the black community for a long time. It's a terrible, evil thing. Everybody agrees on that point. I don't think anyone disagrees. That is over now. There is no longer a system in place that is designed to deprive black Americans of rights. I mean, would you agree with that at least?
No, I do think it's still designed that way, but it's designed in a way where it can't be litigated because it's not in the law.
Okay, but so can you point to me an exact point of the system, an exact place in the system, a policy that is designed to deprive black Americans of rights?
The same people that designed the system to protect the wealth of the upper class, in the throughout American history, like continued to be in control.
Yeah, but now you're talking about class, not race. I'm talking about race.
Right, but how do you disrupt class if you're so segregated by? I mean, how do you disrupt race if you're so segregated by class?
Well, but I don't think you can bring class into this because I would agree that we could talk about class. I'll agree that there are elites who care about themselves and don't care about the lower class. I would say that those people are just as unconcerned with a white person in a trailer park in Appalachia as they are unconcerned with a black person in the inner city.
I agree with Matt Walsh again here. You can't bring class into it. If you're making the point about race, you can't bring in class because I would 100% agree that there's elites out there that want to keep all the wealth. The people at the top want to stay at the top. They care just as little about the white trailer park kid in the Appalachian as they do about the poor black kid in the ghetto. The host there mentioned schools. Look, I'm a big fan of having school choice, and I do think that when it comes to the schooling system, many things could be improved. Charter school, vouchers, school choice. Why shouldn't you be able to drive to a better school if you have a car in 2024? But you can move. We have that option. If you're a parent out there, it's on you to have a responsibility to set up your kids properly. If that means you have to move out of state or to a different city to have a better school, at some point, you have to have a responsibility for your action. It does fall on you. That's why his example of the house was a little bit absurd. You have to have some personal responsibility in life. The system is not inherently racist, but it's also not necessarily there to do everything for you. You're going to have to work hard, but if you make good decisions, as we see in America, you can have generational wealth. You can set yourself up for the future. This is why people come to America from other countries. People that are Asian, people that are black, people that are Hispanic, come to America because it has all the opportunity, because you can make a series of good decisions and change your freaking bum life if you want to, because there is rule of law, because there's better pay, and because Western societies are the least racist societies. And Matt says, point to a point in the laws or anything that you can show me that this is racist, and he can't, because there is no laws that explicitly favor white people. Let's get back to it.
So it is class. We could talk about that, but my question was, because we talk about the system, it's a broad concept here. So let's narrow it down. Let's find a piece of the system that we can point to and say, well, this is designed to hurt black people.
Okay, so if you go to Georgia, for instance, after they implemented school desegregation, what they started doing is saying, oh, okay, well, we can't legally keep black people out of our neighborhoods or out of our schools, but what we can do is we can secede from our neighborhoods. You've been to the Atlanta suburbs?
A little bit.
Like every four...
Unfortunately.
Like every four...
Try to stay away.
Yeah.
Like every 4 blocks for a long time, you had like new school districts, and they would be drawn... They would be just basically gerrymandered. Like they would know where the white people were, and they would gerrymander the school district.
Jump in here right quick and say that when it comes to Atlanta, I think since the 70s, the mayor of Atlanta has been black. This is a very disingenuous argument that this Ryan fellow is saying. It's an outright law. You cannot stop somebody from moving into a suburb area based on race. It's illegal. And the consequences for that are extremely high. It's a class issue, not a race issue that he's pointing out here. Let's get back to it.
So that only white people would be at part of this.
Yeah, but you're going back to desegregation.
No. This is what they're doing now. Like, this is up to today. Like, so what they're doing is they're saying, okay, these are the new laws in place. However, we like our system of segregation and racism that we have here. So how do we hire the best lawyers?
Is that about class? Or
to show that, but it's also about race.
Well, but I'm saying, do you think primarily in the minds of the designers of the system, are they actually discriminating intentionally on a class basis, or is it
pretty race driven?
I don't think that there's any evidence that it's race driven. I think in like an example you give, it's class, it's people wanting to avoid crime-ridden, impoverished areas. Not, maybe someone doesn't want to send their kids to school in a place that's high crime, there's going to be a lot of delinquency and everything in the school system. I don't think it's because the kids are black, it's just because of that. And also, the other thing is when we talk about...
But at what point
when we talk about school districts or the way communities are set up, here's another point that rarely comes up. It's pretty simple. You can move, right? So you can always move. I mean, if you live in a community where you're claiming it's been set up systemically to disadvantage it, I don't buy that. But if I did, I would say, well, you should probably move from that community. I mean, you can go somewhere else. There's no law saying you can't. And if there was a law saying...
Some HOA situations will try to block.
Yeah, but they're not going to say you can't move here if you're black.
It's also why a lot of black community groups support voucher systems to allow, work with conservatives on voucher systems to allow kids to get to different schools.
So when you see stats that say like a black homeowner who's trying to get a mortgage, who has a higher credit score and higher income, gets a higher interest rate from the average bank than a white applicant. A bunch of these studies have been done where they'll put in like a black sounding name and higher credit scores, higher income, better candidates on paper other than their name. And they get there have been so many studies that have replicated this. They get a higher interest rate, which means their cost of borrowing is higher, means the mortgage is higher, which means you have to have that much more money to move into the neighborhood that you're talking about. So systemically, it doesn't say, well, if you're black, you can't live here, but systemically what it does is it makes it easier for white people to move into these wealthier neighborhoods, harder for black people to move into those neighborhoods. And that's before you even get to the wealth effect. Jim Crow, only ended recently, which means that if you look at the kind of savings rates and the inheritance rates for the average black family, it's close to nil, especially after the subprime mortgage wipeout of 2008, compared to white families, which can go to mom and dad and grandma and grandpa and say, can you help put my kids in private school? Can you pay the down payment? 20% is an awful lot for this mortgage.
Generational wealth.
Yeah.
Right.
So you combine the fact that they have to pay higher interest rates with the fact that there's lack of generational wealth. That to me is systemic. But I'm curious specifically on the interest rate question. What's going on there? And should that be a problem that we as a democratic society should address? Like, why are black loan applicants paying higher mortgage interest rates across the board? And that is replicated across the economy.
Okay, I'd have to look at the studies you're talking about. You say that they've been replicated time and time again. There's no issues with the studies, and there's no issues methodology.
I'm sure people could pick some of the studies apart, but it's pretty well accepted.
Yeah, I'd have to know who is accepted by exactly. But so for the sake of argument, let's say that those studies are totally legit. I would still go back to a class issue on that. And the reason is that, look, banks...
But the white...
Well, can we explain? Okay. Like, banks care about the money. That's all they care about. They don't care about... these banks are not being run by people who are saying, we got to keep black people poor. They don't care about that. I don't think they care about anybody. They care about the money. And so if that's happening, they're making stereotypical assumptions, class-based assumptions that I believe they would probably also make if somehow they got they had the impression that this was, say, a white, quote unquote, white trash, as they're often called. from the trailer park. You know, if I think the banks would have the same sort of skeptical, discriminatory attitude in that case as they would to someone who they're assuming is from the inner city, let's say.
Right, but so the other word for that would be implicit bias. So let's say the banks.
We have to wrap, by the way. We have a hard note.
Oh, but let's say we got to wrap in a second. But let's say the banks only do care about money. That's a reasonable thing to say. So then, what could explain why they would treat the two differently? It would have to be like you're saying. But what you're saying is there might be some implicit bias toward if they could identify some poor white guy, which goes to the point though of how it's easier for poor whites, which I was used to be one of, but it was easier for me to migrate out. My name is Ryan Gray.
I don't even think
you can't even tell that I was white trash.
Right.
I mean, you can if you know me pretty well, but but you can't tell on a resume or an application.
You see his arrest
bank.
record.
Yes.
I don't know. You're wearing a tie and everything. I wouldn't say. I mean,
there you go.
You could have fooled me.
Yeah.
Look, but I wouldn't even call it implicit bias. I think it's just like banks. They are biased against people they don't think will pay their mortgage, basically.
Right. And so why don't they think a person with a black name will pay their mortgage?
Because I think in that case,
despite a high credit score and a high income.
If that is true, then they're making assumptions they're making class-based assumptions. This is a lower income person coming from a low income neighborhood, even if their current income is, the same as, that's the background. And so
sounds like those people face a systemic
We gotta
problem.
go.
Well, class-based, but that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, we're getting told.
We're getting in the ear. Matt, thank you so much. This is a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed the movie. Ryan, what'd you think?
It's funny. I'll acknowledge this. The movie's funny. These guys are clowns.
You put that on the poster.
Yeah. These guys are total clowns.
Matt Walsh, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
I think Matt's argument about the house was when it was game over. You can't blame the builder of the house 100 years ago for your lack of maintaining it today. You have to have some responsibility. He mentions the loans at the bank. We'll talk about redlining in a second. You can't mention that it's more difficult for black people to get mortgages and then mention the subprime mortgage wipeout of 2008. Why was there a subprime mortgage wipeout in 2008? Because the government forced banks to make loans to people, minorities, a lot of them, that didn't have a good credit score or was far below par in order to allow more black people to own their homes. Unfortunately, the government was wrong. And all those people who lost their homes and ended up on long-term debt would have been much better off if they had been rejected as applicants. Banks are there to make money. If you meet all the qualifications, and there's a lot of black bankers, they're going to give you the loan. It doesn't matter about your race. They're there to make money. But we want to talk about redlining, which was made illegal in 1968. There was the Illegal Credit Opportunity Act, and that was followed by the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act in, I want to say 1975, which was a predecessor to the Community Reinvestment Act, both of which were attempts to ensure that people who are living in low-income minority neighborhoods could actually get a loan. These things were very effective. In the early 90s, the researchers at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston tried to look at the data, and they collected information on some 30 variables related to lending decisions, and they found that virtually all of the differences between minorities and non-minority denial rates was explained by those variables. A reanalysis of the information found that black-owned banks were actually lending to white-owned businesses at a higher rate than they were lending to black-owned businesses. The bottom line is we can all agree that redlining is an awful policy, and it was made illegal in the 60s, and by the 80s, the banks were not lending at a disproportionate rate. In fact, if you look amongst different communities, and Thomas Sowell points this out, the lady pointed out Thomas Sowell, Asian Americans get loans far easier than white Americans do. That does not mean that the banks are racist towards white Americans on the behalf of Asians. Enough with the victim mentality. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that thumbs up button. Consider subscribing to the channel. Help it grow. I'll catch you all in the next video. Peace out, everybody.